Anyway, that was a terrible intro. Here's Sam's book.
On this episode of Book Reports Podcast,
Dissecting a Frog.
What network is Gotham on?
Sam's Eyelids.
Nipsey Russell.
Twilight.
Thomas Jefferson High.
Jose Mansfield.
Branden hates inanimate objects.
And much, much more.
Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot and Never Be Book Reports Podcast. This is Book Reports Podcast. I'm Bryce Diener.
And I'm Sam, the 10 pounds you resolve to lose, Tyler.
That's a great nickname. And our special guest today is Branden Mestach. Welcome, Branden.
Thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah,
pleasure.
absolutely.
Thanks very much for coming along.
You're welcome. You know, a fun fact about a New Year, I was just in Ethiopia this past October. And in Ethiopia, it's the year 2010.
Really?
How?
Did Y2K hit them harder than the
That's
rest
what
of
it
us?
is. It set them 7 years back. Yeah, all the machines rose up and they had to
They were
fight
just
them off.
celebrating their new year and they said happy 2010 because they don't use the same calendar as we do.
Interesting.
That's interesting. Is it the same amount of months?
No.
Though?
They
No.
have 13 months because they have 30 days in every single month, so they have to make up those 5
Oh,
days.
okay.
They have another month.
Interesting.
We're going to
here's
party like it's
something
2010 in
interesting.
Ethiopia.
Do you guys ever create resolutions for yourself?
No.
No.
They're stupid.
I agree with you completely. I resolve every year to the exact same one. Don't change a darn thing. You're a beautiful, beautiful man. That's what I keep.
And you
Sam
fail
has
in the
that
first 3
on
days.
his mirror at home.
It's on the inside of my eyelids,
Yeah.
man. It's
Oh.
everywhere. Yeah, these are gorgeous eyelids.
Ladies,
Eyelids go in my
Sam
family.
has gorgeous eyelids, just so you know.
That's why we have an
But it's-
audio podcast.
But it's only on the inside, sadly. I can't really share that with the world. But, I sleep happy.
not
Yeah.
until the second date.
Not until yeah, you don't see the insides of my eyelids till the second date, ladies.
My resolution is to never have a resolution, and by having that, I break it every
That's
year.
still a resolution.
Branden, a couple episodes back, we actually had a Reverend Eric Ireland with us, and he happens to be one of your co-workers.
Yeah, great guy.
And we had mentioned that he has his master's degree as a master's of divinity. Is that what you have as well, or is that what you're going for?
Well, I'm in my second year of my master's program. It's not divinity.
Oh.
It's master's of ministry leadership. It's a 2-year degree.
Well,
not
that
a
rolls
4-year.
off the tongue.
Right.
And Bryce, just don't mean to correct you, but I believe you meant to say, Masters of Divinity! 'Cause that's
you're right.
how we have to say it on this podcast.
Is there a particular genre that you like to read? Like, if you're in a bookstore, what section do you always like to go to?
I like fiction based on fact.
So historical fiction mostly, then, kind of
So,
thing.
lies.
Really convincing lies,
Yeah.
I believe what that's called.
No, that's neat, though.
It's like movies based on real life.
Okay.
So the characters might be real, but you don't know if all the stories and the instances that happen in the book are real, but it still can give you a great look into their character and who they might have been and the possibilities. And I love that. Obviously, I'm reading a lot of leadership books right now.
Sure.
I really like how leadership bleeds into ministry. I think first I go to the fiction, see if there's any good series that I can start reading. And then I go over to the leadership because I'm a learner. I like to grow. I believe you can never stop learning.
Books are there to improve us. It's not just to entertain us. And that's a fantastic way to look at it.
Yes.
I agree completely with that. And if we're not doing something with what we're reading, there's not much point in us reading it.
That's very true. Yeah, I like that.
When we had originally invited you to do an episode with us, after we got off our knees pleading with you, you had suggested that you might want to do one of the Twilight books.
No, that's based on fact.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The fact that you can make lots of money writing books about vampires and
Now,
ghosts.
now I'm curious. I want you to...
That was pleasure reading. What happened with that series? I saw the first Twilight.
Okay.
The movie in theaters.
The movie.
Okay.
The movie.
Uh-huh.
And for some reason, it just intrigued me. I don't know if it was that part of my life, but I wanted to see what happened.
Uh-huh.
So I found the books and I got all the rest of them. And it was when I was traveling a lot and I would travel to Africa and the whole plane ride was reading those books.
Now, let me ask you this. You finished the series.
Yes.
So you were intrigued enough to continue the series. What kept you reading those books? Was it characters, the interest of what was going to happen to them?
Yeah, I wanted to
plotting?
see how it ends. I'm a funny book reader. When you have books like that and the one that I'm going to talk about later in the episode, when there's a tension, I need to know what happens.
Okay.
And I'm not the type of person that keeps reading to find out. I go to the last 3 pages of the book.
buddy.
I do this.
Oh, bud.
I know.
Oh.
Just So I can know the ending, but I still enjoy the journey of getting to that ending, even though I know it.
Okay. No, I can see that a little bit, but that's still a bad habit.
In Twilight, what kept me going is I wanted to know the ending so badly, and I knew it was in another book.
Okay.
So when I got to the very ending of the whole Twilight series, I couldn't wait for the movies. And then the very last movies, Breaking Dawn Part 2, I was flabbergasted at how they decided to put a twist in there of the final battle actually happening and people getting killed, and I just was like, wait a second, I don't remember it ending like this. What is going on? Like, this is huge. And then it was Alice was showing if you did engage in battle, this is what was going to happen.
Oh, okay.
I really liked that because I just didn't see that coming. Because the book did not end that way. Well, I liked it.
We'll say Alice was my favorite thing about those movies, period.
Alice in Wonderland, or...
No, the actress who plays was really cute.
Alice could see the future.
And
basically.
She's not only cute, she can see the future. Those are the two things I'm looking for in a woman, I guess.
But
a soothsayer.
I love the
soothing voice.
I love the superpower that not their kid had. For one, Renesmee is her name.
You kind of touched on the two things I respect most about Twilight are the interesting combination of vampiric powers that everybody just kind of gets their own weird little shtick that they have that they can do, which is kind of a neat way to keep things interesting. By I'm a vampire and we have no idea what the heck you can do. Like that keeps it intriguing and interesting. I think the world surrounding the main characters, even though I don't care about the main characters, the world surrounding them is more than fascinating. Is it the third Twilight? Is Eclipse? Mm-hmm. Eclipses, yeah. That book has so many fascinating, weird things happening during it. It's kind of a shame we're watching Bella and Edward, for me personally. Like, there are all these interesting things in the background that are mentioned.
It was probably the weakest book.
I only saw the movie, and I can tell you there were so many things I thought were like, why is this not the plot of the movie instead of the rest of it? I was getting frustrated watching it.
I mean, the whole series kind of led up to Bella's superpower, where Edward couldn't read her mind.
Right.
If you guys remember that. He could read everybody's mind but her. So when she was converted... changed into whatever your wording would be to a vampire, she could block superpowers from getting in to people.
Like Snape.
So Dakota Fanning's character...
Something like that?
Legilimens, yeah.
So Dakota Fanning's character in the movie could cause pain by stimulating her brain.
Yes.
Right. So at the end battle, Bella could reach her powers to everybody, and Alice couldn't paralyze you, in essence, to win the war. So it's cool that they kind of use Bella's human side when she became a vampire.
Now that makes me curious then, do you think the vampire... Sorry, this is a bit off topic, but it makes me wonder, do you think that the vampiric abilities that everybody has as a vampire are directly related to who they are before changing?
Ooh. Man, I think so. I can have to think back on the cases of who Edward was.
And would you use that as a parallel for spiritual gifts?
I have the gift of causing pain. So this past month, the book that I read was Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, The Extraordinary True Story of Shackleton and the Endurance by Jennifer Armstrong. Okay. And that is a fantastic title, Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World. That alone is reason for me to read this book. I mean, my goodness. But it tells the story of Shackleton's failed attempt to cross Antarctica in 1914.
That's a person?
Yes,
Shackleton?
Ernst Shackleton is an Arctic explorer. He was the first person to get within 200 miles of the South Pole in 1908.
But he got bored and turned around.
Remember, this is basically space exploration. This is them doing as far as they can to be the first people to get this close. And then as technology progresses and boats get better, and they're able to get further and further along, 1911, a man named Roald Amundsen reaches the South Pole. And 5 weeks later, Scott reaches the South Pole and discovers, oh, shoot, second. But that's sort of what's going on just before Shackleton's failed expedition happens. He decides, okay, since somebody already reached the South Pole, he's going to be the first person to cross Antarctica. Like, that's the next challenge he's going to meet. And this is 1914, the year of World War I, to put it into context. Like, this is the technology they're using. And I just want to read the beginning quote at the start of this book, which really sets this story very, very nicely. For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. That was said by Applesley Cherry Gerard. And that is exactly what this story is. Shackleton's men have a literal shipwreck at the bottom of the world. They set out on their boat. Before reaching Antarctica, they reach massive flows of ice and glaciers that they can't travel through. And this is usual. You know, if you're going to Antarctica, there's going to be tons of ice, but not this far north. Like, at the time of the season, it's completely ridiculous for it to be this far out. So they have to navigate between the ice flows, and they're moving along very, very slowly. And sometimes the boat gets stuck in the ice, and they have to wait for it to open up again. They're already behind schedule. And then one day, the ice just closes around them, and it doesn't give. They're stuck, not even reaching Antarctica, and they can't go anywhere. They are stuck in the ice from January 1915 to October 27th, 1915. So they are stuck there for 10 months.
My goodness.
With no moving forward. Like, basically, what's happening is the ice is actually moving them away from the continent because the ice is shifting and it's moving their boat. So these guys are stuck there for 10 months with nothing to do. They can't move forward. They can't move out anywhere.
And you thought Rush Hour was bad.
These guys have nothing to do for 10 months. So they have these ridiculous pastimes they make up for themselves.
They didn't bring cards?
That's one of the cool things. One of the guys had a whalebone walking stick, and he broke it, and they used the whalebones as poker chips to be able, and they gambled everything they had at their disposal. Like, they were gambling cigarettes, chocolate, chores. They were gambling everything they could. I think my favorite pastime they had was they brought along sled dogs, and they started making them dog glues. They made them igloos for their dogs. And they started making them more and more elaborately. Like, they had, like, towers and, like, little garages. And
like, they're walking out onto the ice, I'm guessing?
Yeah, the ice floe around them is completely solid. It is thick enough that they are able to go on sled races, and they do all these ridiculous things while they're stuck there to keep morale up. They put on shows, they do mock trials and make up fake crimes for each other. They're doing all these things they can possibly do to stay alive. And they're doing some hunting. Like, there are penguins who have never seen people before, so they just walk up to the guys, and the guys just go, penguin, you know, and here's our meal, you know. But they're stuck in the ice for about 10 months, and the ice is just moving them slowly north. It's very slowly moving them north, so eventually they know, okay, we're going to be free of the ice sometime. It's just a question of when. But eventually the ice does crush the boat they're in.
Whoa.
One day the boat, it turns 45 degrees, and they're stuck on the boat. It's just sitting there. So they get everything off the boat they possibly can. They know it's going to break soon, and eventually the boat is just crushed by the ice all around it, constantly grinding into it.
Oh, sure.
So the guys decide, okay, we don't have a boat anymore. They brought along lifeboats, though. So they've got these boats, and they decide, we can't stay here. We need to make for the edge of the ice pack so we can get to open water, and we can hopefully get to one of the islands nearby.
Who funded this? Like, what country or countries?
They received funding from all over. This was a super important British expedition.
Okay.
Where they received funding from private donors. They received it from schools. Some of the sled dogs were named after the schools that funded them. One of the dogs is named Shakespeare, for example. Another one I think is
Thomas Jefferson High. Get over here right now.
PS 182 was the least exciting sled dog they had. This was mostly British. Before they left, the stirrings of World War I had already started. So some of the guys dropped out of the expedition to go fight for their country.
How many men?
A tentative 34. Yeah. Under 40 guys. Of all those guys who left, they all come home. He didn't lose anybody. The couple of years they were marooned.
Now, you said this happened around the time of World War One.
Yeah, the very start of World War I.
Currently happening at that time?
The World War I broke out just as they were finishing up preparing for the expedition. So some of the men actually left the expedition.
So, I mean, they kind of like avoided the war.
That is true. This has a much lower casualty rate than World War I. That is very true. But after the ship gets destroyed, they leave and they start to pull their boats physically across the ice to hopefully get to open water. And they pull a quarter mile, and they go back, get the next boat, quarter mile again, get the third boat, quarter mile back again.
These are the lifeboats?
Yeah, these are lifeboats. And they realize this is not working, so they set up camp. And they decide, okay, this ice that we're on is going to melt because it is about to become the South Pole summer, which is the opposite of our summer. We're just going to wait for the ice to melt, and we're going to be on this big ice floe. It's like a living raft that's going to be able to move us north, hopefully. And eventually, they're on an ice floe that's just sort of floating north, and they realize we need to get out of the ships and sail and hopefully get help. So Shackleton takes a couple of his guys, I think it's 5 men. They go out in one of the lifeboats they have remaining. The other 2 have been converted into cabins for the men to live in. And it's called the the James Caird, and they sail...
Well, hold on.
I'm sorry?
Let's be honest here. They definitely turned one into dog igloos.
Well, by this point, all the dogs are dead.
Oh, no!
Because the dogs were...
The dogs died.
Meat. You know what I mean? Like, the dogs are meat.
Oh, no.
Actually,
They killed the dogs and ate them.
It gets worse, actually, because some of the dogs had puppies, and before they left, they realized we can't leave these puppies to die here, so they had to mercy kill all the puppies that the dogs had while they were down there.
Word.
They also had to mercy kill Miss Chippy, the carpenter's cat, who was actually a boy named Miss Chippy. I like that detail.
I like that name.
Miss Chippy. So Shackleton leads a small group of guys off to be able to go get help. There's a whaling island nearby where there's a whole bunch of Norwegians who have been killing whales for years. The place smells to high up and it's covered in whale carcasses, and that's where they need to go. They'd been there previously on the way down. So they sail and they reach South George Island where they want to go, but they reach the wrong end of the island.
Oh, no.
So they have to cross what's called the Alps of the Southern Hemisphere. Here's where the cool thing is, I think. Shackleton's party are the first people to cross those mountains.
Really?
They got a record, you know?
Well, there's no point in crossing them other than being the first, I guess.
And they had to cross them because the currents were pulling their boats to the wrong end of the island, so they had to get ashore and they had to cross these literal Alps. And I think that the fact that he was able to reach the Norwegians on South George Island and then send people immediately to go get the rest of his men shows what an incredible leader he was and how he kept everybody alive through this. Like, nobody died. Nobody died during
Except
a
the
literal
dogs.
shipwreck. Except the dogs. They earned
And
it.
Miss
They were awful.
Nipsey or whatever.
Miss Nipsey Russell the cat.
Hey everybody.
Meow.
Meow.
Yeah.
Let me go chase some rats in a ship in the Antarctica.
That's the basic outline of Shackleton's expedition. What made this book amazing for me is Jennifer Armstrong did such a good job presenting the material. She had a writing style which was easy to read. Like, this is about 130 pages long. This is a really short book. And my biggest complaint with this book is that it could be twice as long and I would still love it. I would love to know what she didn't include. Like, this book is so short.
What's her background, do you know?
Well, that's the fun thing about this book. Partway through, I decided to go back to the author's section. This book that I read for Book Reports podcast this month is a scholastic kids book. And I didn't realize it till partway through. Okay? This book is a kid's book.
With dead dogs? And...
Yeah, it's an advanced reader book, I'm sure. Her style of writing is approachable to kids, but I still found it fascinating and riveting. Like, she always kept me interested, and she wasn't writing down, she wasn't talking down to me, she was always keeping it exciting. And she has these really great moments where she leaves these really ominous descriptions that kind of make you wonder what's about to happen. This is after they're having a big party they just threw, and they all dressed up in costumes and put on a show for each other. Outside in the darkness, the endless mass of pack ice was grinding against itself like a restless giant breaking mountains in its sleep. She has these really evocative, ominous descriptions, that sense of threat of nature just coming in and crashing things apart. It's all through this book. And it's written for kids. Like, her style is so much more elevated than who she's writing for. But it would still be accessible as a kid's book. Like, this
was
is
that written?
1998.
The Clinton
did she do like a
administration.
first-hand interview with this dude, or
No, this is an incredibly well-documented expedition because almost all the guys made fortunes off of writing biographies because they had nothing else to do. So they're writing journals and stuff like that. Everybody wanted to know what happened while they were down there. Like, they were the toast of London society for a while.
Where's my dog?
Yes.
I'm sorry, school children.
dog.
Where's Thomas Jefferson High?
Thomas Jefferson High, we love you. That's really wonderful.
Just a devastated,
He was
like,
dinner.
Yeah, he was delicious.
Second month.
He was delicious.
He was
great. Well, they also brought along a nature photographer. So it's very, very well documented. She's able to go to first-hand records and get all this precious information. And she did such a good job. I mean, this was one of those books that I just couldn't believe
Sounds
I
like
was
it
reading
could be a
kid's book.
movie.
Oh, easily. Oh, well, they are sitting around a boat for a year. It'd have to be a drama interaction movie, I suppose. But it is a great story. I mean, the stuff that they went through.
You look at Castaway.
Oh, there you go. That's a good point. Yeah, that's the exact situation they're in. You're absolutely right.
That was Tom Hanks. I mean, Tom Hanks could...
But it was
plays
just Tom
Shackleton.
Hanks.
right.
and
So,
and a
That's
volleyball.
the appeal. It's like, just Tom Hanks for 2 hours? Yes, please. I don't care what he's doing.
Meow.
Tom Hanks.
AKA The Terminal. It's the exact same movie. Only Catherine Zeta-Jones is the volleyball.
All right, so this is the question you always ask me. Was there something you didn't like about the book? I know you said you wished it was bigger.
I wish it was bigger.
It was longer.
I wish I could have had another 100 or 200 pages of her telling me stuff about this expedition. There are things, looking back on it, that she could have talked a lot more about, I think. She could have gone into a lot more detail about who these men were going in. Like, I got reasonable glimpses of who they were, but she could easily have spent another 10 pages on that. She could have spent a lot more time giving details on the background of Arctic expeditions, or Antarctic expeditions.
Listen, it's either Uncle Arctic
Now listen, son, let me tell you something. It's either Razgal Fazgabaz or...
It's either Uncle Arctic Expedition or Antarctic Expedition. Let's think of it.
Nailed the joke in one. Yeah.
It was. I just read this the other day. I think it was from E.E. Cummings. He said, explaining a joke is like dissecting a frog. Open it up, you understand how it works, but then you end up killing the frog. That's not what I did. I just ended up killing the frog anyway. And I didn't explain anything.
There was no dissection. We just have a dead frog in a bucket. Yeah. So, Branden, what book did you bring to talk about today?
I brought a book called Covenant of War. It's the second book in the Lion of War series by Cliff Graham. Cliff Graham is an Army veteran, loves war, studies war, and he likes to take scripture and just expound on it. So this book is fiction based on fact. And the reason I like it so much is it's based on my favorite character in the whole Bible, King David. And we get to the scripture where they talk about the mighty men, King David's mighty men, and the big three. If you want to check out those stories, it's 2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11. First book, the whole series opens up with King David looking for smooth stones to load up for his fight with Goliath. But he just expounds on that story of what King David might be thinking during that time, and then goes into the story of Benaiah. Benaiah is just one of the men who protects King David. Benaiah basically is the focus of the first book and how he's the assassin of King David.
Okay.
When King David wanted a job done, somebody killed Benaiah.
Benaiah is his Luke.
You're my guy. Yeah, you're my guy.
Benaiah said you're gonna die.
Yes.
Benaiah Twain.
But Benaiah was there when King David died, and then he also was a part of King Solomon's army too before Benaiah died. So he had King David and then Solomon right after.
To Solomon, he's that big scary guy who worked for my father.
Right. Right. So Benaiah is one of the main characters in the whole David's Mighty Men story. But this book is more so on Eleazar. David's legendary three stories were told about them for generations to come is Eleazar, Joshua, and Shammah. So these books, there's 5 of them. Okay. Only 3 are out. The 4th one's coming out here soon. I'm really excited about how he's going to explain the whole Bathsheba thing.
Oh, okay.
Uriah the Hittite is one of David's mighty men. One of the 30 guys that are fighting for King David. It actually gives reference to Uriah's beautiful wife. And here he does. You see, this isn't scripture. This is kind of taken out from scripture. Yeah. But it's expanding on my favorite Bible stories.
Is each book focusing on one of the men particularly?
Focusing, yes. Okay. So Benaiah was kind of the first one, just because I think we know a little bit about Benaiah. He fought a lion in a pit on a snowy day. That is biblical, but he goes more into that story. But it's basically just a ragtag crew of men that David relies on. A lot of these men really don't even like King David. They like him because they know that God is with him. And why I love these books is, while it is fiction, a lot of times you'll find King David, he's a side note in this series, but it's revolved around him.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So they go into the story of the big 3 and Benaiah, those 4 kind of the focuses. But then you get other people like Joab, the commander of the army, and how he comes into all this. Like I said earlier, Uriah, how he's a Hittite. He's not even Jewish, but David loved having mercenaries in his army. And he got criticized, David did, about having these men that they're not even Jews and you're having them fight for the Lord. And King David's like, well, who cares? Let's let the Lord transform them. So it's really cool. This takes place in 990s BC.
Backstreet Boys were huge.
Backstreet Boys.
Rugrats was on TV. SNL was good back then.
Right. But then these books will have statements like this that Benaiah says, Yahweh uses broken men. I don't know why he uses David, why he uses any of us. And that's kind of like in their moment of war. They go into detail about all of David's victories, all of the wars that are biblical, but he uses these guys' backstory and all of the strengths that they have. It just goes into those types of stories. And you learn a lot about King David in these moments that while he was a man after God's own heart, like he was a fierce warrior. He killed a lot of people, even some of his own men if they crossed him. So this book basically focuses more so on Eleazar. You don't know a ton about Eleazar other than like one snippet in the aforementioned scripture verses. And so he just expands on him basically. How did he come to know King David? Basically, King David's army is a little bit of this person's and a little bit of King Saul's past army and fought with Jonathan. And some of these guys, I'm pretty sure it was Eleazar, is one who fought with Jonathan and wanted David to die in that battle and not Jonathan.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's not biblical.
Right.
But this book kind of portrays Eleazar as that way.
Has he written anything but Bible fiction?
He also did write a battle book, a devotional book.
Oh, okay.
To go along with these.
That's interesting. So that makes me wonder then. Because this is a book about human characters and human beings sometimes make mistakes. Unless you're making a podcast, then it's always perfect and doesn't require any editing.
Editing!
Do you see these guys making lots and lots of bad choices, and is he commenting on bad choices? What's his view of the characters based on what they're choosing to do?
We don't know a lot of their bad choices biblically.
But like one of them's an assassin, like you were saying.
Yes, but
Like how's
all
that?
of that is for King David and the Lord. If you did it for King David, it's because the Lord has his hand on King David. So you're more so doing it out of the fear of the Lord rather than the fear of David.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because they know the covering has come upon David. They know the story of David being anointed by Samuel. So all of their killings, all of the assassinations that they performed weren't consequences to them.
Okay.
They were obedience to the Lord.
Wow. Very, very Old Testament. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. Is that shocking and hard to read and to accept as you
No,
read?
no,
or?
because the Old Testament God is a little different than the New Testament God in how he relates to us and how we relate to him.
Why we do see a difference between Old Testament God and New Testament God, even though it's the same God. He was just building up this kingdom.
He's not different.
Right.
His relation, the relationship between God and his people changed because of
Right.
Christ.
Okay.
Yes. And so now, since we do live in the new covenant, we do want to focus on the New Testament. But how we need to focus on that is the Old Testament proves the New Testament true. God is loving, but he's also a just God. God is also all-knowing and all-powerful. So in the Old Testament, we see people getting mowed down by God's people, setting up the promised land that God promised us.
I do want to ask about your book. Being that you do have a very strong biblical background, you are easily able to tell which was biblical and which was not.
Sure.
Do you think the average reader who could pick up that book would be able to tell when he is creating fiction and when, like, can they tell the difference between fact and fiction?
Yeah, I think it's important when you dive into books like this because going into this series, you know it's based on fact because the book tells you. So knowing that, I would suggest read scripture first because you know going in this is going to be fiction. So I already knew that a lot of this wasn't going to be specifically in the Bible.
Okay.
So I needed to go in with it thinking, while these are real characters, most of these stories might not have been true.
Sure.
So that's how I read it. But you're right. I knew a lot about King David's life. I knew a lot about these stories that he's depicting. I know what was in scripture. So if you really care to keep it biblical and you don't want your theology to be wrecked by something like this, you need to read scripture first. So if you're going to get these books, you need to read the story of David and especially his mighty men. Now, if you just focus on the mighty men, you're not really going to have a lot to read.
I was going to say it's a lot shorter if you just read the original book.
But because David is in every single book, and he's kind of the main character, but he isn't. It all revolves around his story. Read all of David's story first, and then I think you're going to enjoy the book more.
Part of the fun, I think, of reading these kind of books is seeing the extrapolation of seeing what they're pulling out from and seeing the original sources. Have you ever seen anything that didn't fit with you reading these?
Didn't fit with me.
Yeah, like things
so
that just
it
felt like
unsettled because it was too far off of scripture.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, too far from the original source material.
I don't think so. How he portrayed King David was sometimes a little rough for me. How could he kill his own men because his own men put them in danger? I mean, he just come and slit their throats to make an example of them that you don't cross me, in essence. I never really thought of King David as that type of
thug
character, thug type person. And so sometimes when he creates David in that realm, I'm just like, I don't know if that really happened, but it could have.
Right.
Because David was a fierce, mighty warrior, and his basis was, when you go against the Lord, you go against me. And when you go against the Lord, I have the right to kill you. Basically.
Very Old Testament attitude.
Yeah. We see David in that light with Bathsheba.
Yeah, exactly. That human life
he is rough.
Yeah.
And he is willing to kill one of his 30 mighty warriors.
Or for listeners who don't know that story, David went on his roof one night when his army was off fighting, when he should have been with them. He sees this beautiful girl bathing on the roof. He's like, hey, she's a good looking lady. Invites her over. She gets pregnant. He's like, uh-oh, you're married. Finds out that her husband happens to be one of his men, Uriah, who was mentioned earlier. So David ends up having him killed in battle so that he can marry Bathsheba.
Killing him was kind of a last resort to cover up. But the whole thing about that story is, what if there wasn't Bathsheba? What if David would have been at war?
Where he was supposed to be.
Who would King Solomon come from?
Yeah, I was going to say Bathsheba's Solomon's mother.
Right.
For more information, see the VeggieTales episode, King George and the Rubber Ducky.
Or read your Bible.
VeggieTales are stupid. They should all be thrown into a frying pan.
Whoa.
Not a VeggieTales fan?
No.
Oh, please tell me more. Tell me more.
I don't like personification. I think it's why people care so much about pets and objects that the movies have personified. It just annoys me.
Really?
Yeah.
In that case, I want to tell you, my car's name is Babe.
Yeah, right.
And I do refer to her as a she.
Well, I don't name my...
Do you hate the Brave Little Toaster movies? Like that stuff too? Like, it makes me wonder. What about Toy Story? Like, what's the...
Tom Hanks.
Yeah, the thing with Toy Story is it's a good story.
Okay.
I love it. And I don't think I have too much of an issue with Toy Story as I do with, even VeggieTales too. I don't know. In a way, I think it kind of makes us weak.
Okay. By personifying
things that don't matter, that we care too much about.
Okay.
Like, I believe as a culture, we've become weak where we almost have more of a liking to animals than we do of even human beings. You look at the sanctity of life, you look at abortion and how those babies aren't as protected as most animals are. And I just think it just causes something that isn't necessary.
See, I agree with you mostly because I know I do this way too often. I used to work for a thrift store, and one of the jobs I was given one day was to throw away all the stuffed animals we couldn't keep in the store, and it broke my heart. Like, I was thrown away.
Because of Toy Story.
They're cute little fuzzy things. I started throwing one, and it went, and it was like, oh, I can't possibly throw this away now.
Toy Story could be real.
It told me not to throw it away, so I kept it. Then another one came out, and it was a rabbit literally doing the folded hands praying thing. And it was like, oh, I can't throw this away. So I still have this rabbit that is in a praying position. Like, it was begging me for its life. It's like, I can't throw it. So I've got this little Schindler's List of toys I couldn't throw away. So
that would be something of, what if you've never seen the personification of inanimate objects?
It is designed to be as cute and as adoring as It's shaped like a dog. These stuffed animals were designed to not be hated. They were designed to be adored and to have affection thrown on them. And I couldn't help myself from
but they don't
throwing that on.
reciprocate the feelings, Sam.
They do not.
The voice box does.
They cannot feel pain.
I'll have you know, I have yet to be eaten by the monster in my closet, and I attribute that to all my stuffed animals. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. Pretty sure.
And while Monster Inc. is a very innocent children's flick,
it's still dumb, and he wants them thrown into a crisper. That's That's what Brandon's saying. Yeah. That is fascinating, Brandon.
Personification.
See, I thought you were going to go
love
the route of it doesn't portray the biblical message properly, maybe, or like.
No, this is not biblical at all.
But I mean, you took it a whole different, like, if you
Yeah,
gave me
that is
100
not what I was
years to guess,
expecting
that is
either.
not what I would guess.
loved that, Brandon.
Yeah.
I really did. That was fascinating.
I bet you hate the movie Cars as well. Ugh.
There's another reason to hate that movie.
I enjoyed Cars. I just don't like when people take cars out of context and fish out of context and sharks out of context.
That I read for this episode is called King Heist, the sensational bank robbery of 1878 that shocked America by J. North Conway. And so what this does is this book covers the story of a man named George Leslie, who was born in Cincinnati. This is around the time of the Civil War that he's growing up. He became a ripe age of a Civil War draftee, and so he was drafted into
10. I believe that's the
he was drafted into the Civil War. Back then, if you were rich enough, you could pay to get out of it.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt's father did that.
George Leslie's father was like, yeah, you're not going to fight off in the Civil War. So he went to architecture school. During this entire time, though, he's seen as a social pariah because he never went and fought in the Civil War. And so he is surrounded by these Civil War veterans that are like sitting on this side of the street. They're begging. They're in tattered uniforms. And so he feels socially scorned. So like, okay, this is my cue to just pick up stakes and leave. And so he moves to New York City. And instead of continuing his career as an architect, he says, I'm just going to pick up a life of crime. Nothing really.
Well, my family's dead.
Yeah.
I think it's time to start a brand new thing.
That's what I
What
did.
a go-getter. What a go-getter.
His father's dying
Good
words
for
were,
him.
I bet you can't rob a bank.
Prove you wrong, Dad.
Back at this time, if you think about it, this is not like Al Capone era. That's like the more like the early 1900s. This is like 1870s, late 1860s.
Jesse James.
Outward Expansion.
And actually, Jesse James was an idol that he looked up to.
So this is the rise of all the robber barons. This is the Gilded Age. So this is actually a good place to be a criminal.
We get a lot of mentions of Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, all those people.
Railroad people.
This story makes more sense now. I think I'd become a criminal. Come to think of it.
This needs to be a movie too.
Honestly, I'm going to get to that. I think it needs to be a show though. Either HBO or I think Fox can maybe do it some justice because like they do. Or no, I guess CW does the new Batman show.
Gotham is not on CW.
Is that Fox?
Gotham?
I think it's Fox.
If only they sponsored us, we would know where it was.
Is it FX? That doesn't.
Let's look
seem
up. I'll let him look it
CW
up,
to
and
me.
then I'll say it correctly.
There's no teenagers. It can't be CW.
It's on Fox. Okay.
Fox.
Take that.
Yeah, so I think this would definitely work good as a television show, and I will try to make that argument later. Because I'm trying to do my book.
Trying very hard.
I spent the last 2 days reading the majority of the book.
If you did not listen to the end of the episode with Pastor Eric, please do. It's our greatest outro ever. It's going to be hard to top.
What was I saying? Okay, so he moves.
1870s.
Yeah, he moves to New York City. There's a very famous restaurant there called Delmonico's. I don't know if it's still around, but back then that was the place to be if you were a rich individual.
Right.
You may have heard
The Golden Corral of its time.
He walks right into Delmonico's and he immediately recognizes Jubilee Jim Fisk, who is a stockbroker on the New York Stock Exchange. He's very famous at the time.
If your nickname is Jubilee, you've done something right with your life.
He was a individual that people could just walk up to him and be like, "Hey, I need a coat, or I need a couch, or I just like want some extra money."
Go.
Yeah, he just gave stuff away to these individuals. And so he became a man of the people.
Okay.
When he eventually was jailed for a stock that he fixed.
Okay.
Fixed this time. It was
on Fox.
It was a Jubilee Jamboree.
Fisk.
Yeah.
Fisk.
Jim Fisk. Jim Fisk and Jay Gould buy the stocks when they're low, and they sell it right before this money is about to enter the market, which will bring down the stock. And so they actually had a few partners that they're like, hey, you should throw your money in with us because we know this is about to happen. They intended to screw these guys over.
Oh, okay.
And only Jay Gould and Jim Fisk really made a profit off this, and a lot of the people that they considered friends, they actually screwed over. And this one of these individuals was George Leslie. He comes in, he becomes friends with Jubilee Jim Fisk, and he says, hey, you should get in on this. George Leslie's like, no, I think I'm going to go a different route. And that route was bank robbing. What ends up happening one day...
So you're saying he made the right choice because he was just going to get stolen from.
He was going to get stolen from anyway.
Make the wise choice, kids. Become a bank robber in the 1870s.
he is accepted into this inner circle of New York City back in the 1870s and 1860s, around this time. And so he's introduced to this woman named Marm Mandelbaum, who she is the number one fence in the New York City.
How progressive.
Not in terms of separating one property from another, but a fence is someone that you give your stolen property to, and they essentially clean it up and sell it for a profit. She kept most of the profit, but she gives you a cut because you stole it. Yeah, essentially, yeah. A dirty pawn shop is what she was. And so she throws these elaborate parties for all the rich. And honestly, at this time, New York City is a very criminally ridden area. Like, the police are up, the politicians have been bought out by Boss Tweed is another big name. You
the machine politics are pretty hard in New York.
The newsies are running wild on the streets.
Beating up people, forcing them to buy their papers.
And singing while they're
And singing.
And so she throws one of these elaborate parties that these individuals show up to. Jubilee Jim Fisk invites George Leslie to one of these parties, and that's where he is introduced to her. In the process of him being in New York, he loses his wallet. In his wallet, he had about $200 worth of money, but also he had these blueprints for he called it a little joker, and I hated that the author called it that. That's not what George called it, but they kept calling it the little joker, and every time it would show up in the book, I was like, that's stupid.
Oh, it's my little joker.
Yes. So what it is a device. You go up to a safe. These are like the turnstile safes for a tumbler. And what you do is you pop that off, you put the little joker inside, and then you put the dial back on it. And whenever they enter the correct combination, the little joker somehow memorizes those numbers. They didn't actually specify in this book how that was created, probably so you wouldn't rob banks.
Well, 1870s banks. I think we're probably okay now.
I think we are. They did a couple.
I think we're all right. It latches onto the tumblers and it stays on top of them. Maybe.
I think so. Or else, maybe it could be some sort of wax that the tumblers carve into, possibly. And so you get the number combination, but it doesn't give you the actual order. And so if you only have three numbers, you have only to try it 3 different times to try and break into the safe. But the issue is that you have to break into the bank once, pop off the spinner, put in the little joker, and then walk away. And then break in again. And so that's the danger of using this. But at this time, what they were doing instead was using dynamite to break into these banks. You were losing the product inside. If you used too much dynamite, you ended up killing yourself instead.
And blowing up the money.
Yeah, exactly. And so...
like an idiot. You end up looking like an idiot.
Because Marm Mandelbaum was this fence that all these stolen goods come to, his wallet ended up in her hands. And so when he's at this party, somehow it mysteriously comes back to him. And she pulls him aside. Is like, listen, I know what these blueprints are because people have tried to create these devices before. His just happens to be the best one because he's an architect. And she's like, listen, I want to know why you had these blueprints, what you want to do. And so he just spilled the whole beans. He's like, listen, I'm an upright character. I don't want to be this shiny member of society anymore. I want to rob banks. She's like, okay, let's see what we can do.
That is fantastic. She saw his resume and goes, hey, here's what we want to do. That is fantastic.
One of her goons was in jail. He's like, okay, if you can break this guy out of jail, we'll start going to banks. And so back in these days, it was just like the town jail. And so what he ended up doing is just renting the building next to it. They dug a tunnel into the guy's cell, bribed the guards. He
doesn't appear to be a criminal for the sake of the money, so I guess that's good, considering how much he's spending.
I do think it's the rush of it.
He's clearly not in it for the money.
So, Bryce, what king comes into play in this heist?
The name King Heist, the name of the book, actually comes from the fact that he eventually was really good at becoming a bank robber. He actually was so good at becoming the architect of these bank robberies that he planned them out. He would pick the crews, that he would actually lease himself out to other gangs.
Oh, so he was an independent contractor.
Yeah, exactly. So he would contract himself out to these other gangs.
Oh, that's great.
Not just the ones that Marm would bring about to rob these banks. And never using dynamite at all. Yeah, to answer your question, he was called the king of bank robbers. So that's where the name King Heists come from. He had 2 heists that he did that were huge bank heists.
Okay.
I think the one was the Ocean National Bank, which was, I think, either in New Jersey, really close to New York City.
It was in Atlantis.
But how do you get enough oxygen down there to rob the bank?
Well, let me tell you, I've got this little joker.
Oh, no. Immediately punch in the face for just saying that. Little joker. No, you're out. Marm had these warehouses where she would store a lot of the stuff. And he says, hey, can we get about maybe $3,000? He recreates the entire bank inside this warehouse. He builds a bank inside this warehouse. He would go into the actual bank, the real bank, and because he is a high member of society, he has a lot of money. They want to create accounts with him, and so he like looks around. He has a very good, I wouldn't call it photographic memory.
He's an architect's eye for the building.
And so he gets like the floor plans just by walking in there often enough, and so he's able to build.
His feet were exactly 1 foot long. So he was always taking very small steps and counting.
Yeah. And so he's like creating this in his mind's eye, and then he creates it in this warehouse.
Yeah.
And then his gang rehearses for months and months and months in this makeshift bank as they try to break in. And what he ends up doing in those months, he becomes friends with like the president of the bank. And it's like, hey, I know this guy who's kind of down on his luck. Could you maybe hire him to be your cleaner after hours? And so for months and months, this individual that they've hired is doing a fine job cleaning, and he's their inside man that he just is there after hours, lets him right in the door. And so you have your man who is the dial guy who pops off the dial like the Safecracker. You have him with his little joker. What is another name we can call
The first time you mentioned it, I thought, what's Bryce making the big deal about? But having said this twice, I don't want to call it that either.
Little joker. Steven.
The loculator.
I'm going to call it Steven.
The safe-cracking
gal.
The safe-cracking gal.
Anyway, and so I think there's like 4 or 5 people on each team. And so what they would do is they would go for the unmarked bills. They would go for the safety deposit boxes. People who kept their money in banks were the rich. They could take these hits.
Right.
If you were a poor individual,
you didn't have anything to put in the bank.
You didn't trust banks. You didn't have anything to put in the banks. You just kept it with yourself. And so when these stories would be published, the general public was fascinated by these stories. It's like, I'm not being robbed. It's these rich people who are being robbed. The rich people who are actually being robbed is like, well, it's a pretty big hit to me, but I'll recover.
Right.
And so it was never seen as a big public issue.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So these guys were heroes, effectively.
Essentially, yeah.
And an annoyance.
Modern day robbers.
Worst.
Yeah, exactly. One of the jobs that he contracted, though, he went out to San Francisco and helped contract a job out there. They didn't want to listen to him. He's like, you know what, I'm just getting out of here before I get arrested for your stupidity. They end up kidnapping one of the bank tellers at his home, roughing him up to get the combination out of him that way. And that was kind of the turning point. It's like this bank teller wasn't a rich guy. He was just a guy trying to make a living and do his best. And suddenly it became a personal issue that bank robbing wasn't just this.
It's not just vaguely hurting the rich people.
Exactly.
The people who work in the bank are being hurt too.
Exactly. And so he did have one last big job that he wanted to complete. It was the Manhattan Savings Institution. And so he's been planning this for months and months and months. What's going on behind the scenes, though, is that some of the individuals in his gang, when he would send them out as independent contractors.
Oh, so he was hiring out his employees?
Gang, yeah.
Oh!
To help these other smaller guys.
That is great!
And so what he would do when they were out of town is he would have affairs with their wives.
That is less great. I take back all my enthusiasm, folks.
Oh, that's great too! Oh, marital unfaithfulness.
Good for him. Good for him.
And so one of the guys actually finds out, and in June 1878, George Leslie's body is found, abandoned. No one was ever charged for the murder. No one was ever found, but it's most likely believed that it was one of these individuals.
Right.
Found out about the affair, came back to town. Yeah, the biggest heist that he is called the King of Bank Robbers for happened in October. He was killed in June of that year. So he was never a part of this bank robbery that he's given a lot of credit for.
But he made the plans and the robbery did go off?
Yeah. The gang that he was still with, just like, okay, we're going to do this anyway.
We're dedicating this bank heist to George Leslie.
They spray paint his name on the side. I mean, it's kind of sad that he never got to be a part of it, but at the same time, like, I'm cheering on a criminal, which is weird. And no one was ever charged for that bank robbery at all either. People who were in the gang were charged in other crimes, and so a lot of them did end up going to jail anyways. Sure. But no one was ever actually implicated in that robbery.
George Leslie's last robbery, the one he didn't take part in, was successful.
Yeah, it was his most famous robbery.
Aww. That's just like all these great painters. They're more famous after their death.
That's
sadly.
right. A couple of things here I found. Going back to Boss Tweed, there was a political cartoonist who really drew a lot of bad cartoons about him, and so that changed the public eye about him. Oh, sure. It was actually part of his downfall. Was his name was Thomas Nast. So Thomas Nast's cartoons in Harper's Weekly helped bring about the downfall of the once all-powerful Boss Tweed. And although Nast is probably best remembered for his role in bringing down Tweed, his contributions to American culture and society are still predominant today. Nast created what was first to be published the caricature of the Republican and Democratic parties, the elephant and the donkey, respectively.
Oh, okay.
Although he didn't create it, Nast did popularize the caricature of Uncle Sam, and he also created the image we now think of as Santa Claus, inspired by the poem The Night Before Christmas. Ironically, Nast had to have his wife read the poem to him since he could not read or write.
Oh.
So a famous cartoonist
That's
working
interesting.
for a national newspaper, creating these public icons, and he was illiterate.
Now that seems only tangentially related to George Leslie's story. Is this book full of background information like
This author, the first 70 pages or so, I hated it. Because, he gives the example of George Leslie going to this famous party. He's like, oh, who was at this dinner party? This individual. And he goes on for 3 pages about that individual. Who's that person friends with? Here's 3 more pages about a random person. He doesn't only go on rabbit trails, he forces the rabbit to make a trail. He picks up the rabbit, makes it make a trail.
Are the people he's talking about interesting?
Once you start reading the book more, like once you get past those first 70 pages, you're like, oh yeah, these people are being mentioned a lot more. I guess that was relevant. He could have spread it out.
So made it more gradual.
Yeah. And the book is about bank robbing, so I really wanted to get into like how he's doing all this stuff. I think it was necessary for the story in the end to introduce all these people. Like, I mean, he does mention Jubilee Jim Fisk. He mentions Boss Tweed. He mentions her name is Josie Mansfield, who is the love interest of Jim Fisk, and it's Josie without an I. So when I first saw it, I thought it was Jose. Jose Mansfield. Hola, George. It's me, Jose.
So that should do it for this episode of Book Reports Podcast, our first in 2018.
They haven't canceled us yet, and we have another year to prove it.
We have another year to prove it that we're not being canceled. The censors couldn't keep us down.
That's right.
Yeah. Brandon, thanks a lot for coming on the show today. Thanks a lot for your insights, and thanks for reading a book for us.
Yes, thank you so
That's
much.
always appreciated.
Yeah, you're welcome. I have a lot of books I've read, so don't be a stranger.
Monthly guest from now on. I think that's what the people are saying, Brennan. Monthly guest.
Yeah. Write that in the comment section.
You basically got like 2 for 1 because we talk about Twilight and everything like that.
Oh,
Like,
you're
that's
right.
like, you
Yeah,
talked
we
about, like,
kind of.
8
I think we
books
talk
today.
about Twilight more.
We'll just cut that out now into the next episode.
I mean, I could talk about every single book of Twilight, every single character.
What you're saying is when we start the Twicast, you're going to be our first guest.
I better be your first and only guest on the Twicast.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Book Reports Podcast, you can find our last few episodes on SoundCloud. On iTunes, you can find our entire back catalog, and you can also leave us a rating or a review. That'd be lovely. Helps people find the show. You can like us on Facebook and find pictures of how incredibly handsome we are. You can contact us by sending us an email at bookreportspodcast@gmail.com. And if you like me, and I hope you do, because I know I do too, you can find more of me at skullduggeryinthesmoke.blogspot.com, which is my blog for all my game writing. Our show music is by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more of his music at incomputech.com. Thank you, Kevin. The music's great.
We haven't really gotten a lot of verbal or written down
Mostly
feedback.
Mostly physical feedback.
Yeah,
Just slaps and hugs.
Punches to the gut is what we've got. And so, until you guys actually write us in and leave us some comments that we can share on air, I've decided to take reviews of other entertainment and just splice in our names instead of the actual event. So the New York Times raves, the Book Reports Podcast is the best musical about cats that you will see this year. Thanks, New York Times.
The Chicago Tribune says that Book Reports Podcast is the hottest movie this summer. Danny Glover and Mel Gibson have never been better together. Joe Pesci really rounds out the cast nicely. Book Reports Podcast is even better than Lethal Weapon 1. Thanks a lot for listening, and we will see you next episode of Book Reports Podcast. Happy New Year, everybody.
I once insulted my one friend at work. I said to him, yeah, it's great fun. I said, you have a voice for... or
television? Or a face for radio?
A face for radio and a voice for silent films.
And he didn't get it.
Because I kept stumbling over it like an idiot.
You have a face for silent... radio and
A foot for... Why are we recording this?